When 17-year-old Margaret Caldwell defied her Union colonel father to free the captured Comanche warrior she'd fallen in love with, she shattered every chain that bound her to a life of duty and submission. But as the empty stockade stands as testament to her choice, and Aiyana rides toward freedom carrying her mother's locket, one question haunts the Kansas prairie. Can love truly bloom eternal when it's watered with sacrifice and rebellion? The screams came before dawn, cutting through the October morning like a blade through silk. Margaret Caldwell jolted awake in her narrow bed at Fort Harker, her heart hammering against her ribs as the sound of galloping horses thundered past her window. Outside, soldiers were shouting orders, their boots pounding across the wooden walkways of the Kansas Territory outpost. "Apache raid," someone yelled. 3 miles south. Margaret pressed her face against the cold glass, watching torches bob like fireflies in the darkness. Her father's voice boomed across the parade ground, sharp with command. Colonel James Caldwell stood near the gate, his blue uniform already buttoned despite the early hour, directing mounted soldiers toward the river. "Bring back survivors if you find any," he called. "Prisoners, too. We need information about their numbers." The word prisoners made Margaret's stomach twist. She'd seen what happened to captured Indians at the fort. They disappeared into the stockade, emerging days later as broken men who stared at nothing with empty eyes. Her mother had always said such treatment was wrong, but Mother had been dead for 2 years now. By the time the sun painted the prairie gold, the patrol had returned. Margaret watched from her window as they dragged a single figure from the back of a supply wagon. The man's copper skin was streaked with blood, his long black hair matted with dirt. Even injured, he moved with a dignity that made the soldiers nervous. "Comanche," she heard Lieutenant Morrison say as he passed beneath her window. "Found him half dead by Willow Creek. No weapons, no horse. Probably fell behind during the raid." Margaret's hands trembled against the glass. The prisoner was younger than she'd expected, maybe 25, with broad shoulders and strong hands that remained steady even as the soldiers bound them with rope. When he raised his head, she saw eyes the color of deep water, filled with intelligence and pain. "Father says they're all murderers," she whispered to herself, repeating the words she'd heard 100 times. But looking at this man, she couldn't make herself believe it. The soldiers hauled him toward the wooden stockade at the fort's center. Margaret had walked past it every day for 15 years, but she'd never really looked at it before. Now she saw how small it was, how the bars cast shadows like prison stripes across the dirt floor. "Margaret Ann!" Her father's voice startled her away from the window. "Come down here!" She found him in the kitchen, pouring coffee from a dented pot. His weathered face showed the strain of command, deep lines carved by years of frontier duty. At 45, Colonel Caldwell looked older than his age, worn down by the endless cycle of raids and revenge that defined life in the territories. "Did you see the excitement this morning?" he asked, not looking at her. "Yes, sir. I heard the alarm. We caught one of them, a Comanche warrior." He sipped his coffee, his eyes distant. "They killed the Henderson family last week, burned their cabin, took their cattle. This savage might know where they're hiding." Margaret's stomach clenched. "How do you know he was involved?" "Because he's Comanche, and Comanche don't travel alone unless they're scouting or running from something." The colonel's voice hardened. "In 3 months, you'll marry Lieutenant Morrison and leave this place. I want you to remember why we fight these people. They're not like us, Margaret. They don't value life the way civilized folks do." "Yes, Father." The words felt like stones in her mouth. After breakfast, Margaret walked across the parade ground toward the stockade. She told herself she was just curious, that she wanted to see the prisoner who'd caused such a stir. But as she approached the wooden cage, she felt something else stirring in her chest, a strange combination of fear and fascination. The Comanche sat cross-legged in the center of the small space, his back straight despite his wounds. Up close, she could see the intricate tattoos that spiraled across his chest, the silver pendant that hung from his neck. His face was younger than she'd thought, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that spoke of determination rather than cruelty. "You're staring." His voice made her jump. The words were heavily accented but clear, proving he understood English despite his silence with the soldiers. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to. Your father told his men I don't speak their tongue." The prisoner's eyes met hers, and she saw humor flickering in their depths. "Sometimes it's better to let people think you're stupid. They say things they shouldn't." Margaret glanced around nervously. The nearest guard was 20 feet away, facing the other direction. You shouldn't be talking to me. And you shouldn't be talking to me. Yet here we are. He shifted slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. What's your name? Margaret. Margaret Caldwell, the colonel's daughter. It wasn't a question. I heard them talking about your wedding. 3 months, they said. Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks. That's not your concern. No, he agreed quietly. But you don't look happy about it. The observation hit too close to home. Margaret had been dreading her marriage to Lieutenant Morrison since the day her father announced it. Charles Morrison was a good soldier and a decent man, but he looked at her like she was a prize to be won rather than a person to be loved. I should go, she said, backing away from the cage. Wait. The prisoner's voice was soft but urgent. What do they plan to do with me? Margaret's throat felt dry. I don't know. Father says they need information about your people. And after they get it? She couldn't meet his eyes. They both knew the answer. Indians who were captured rarely lived long enough to see their homes again. The territorial government paid bounties for scalps, and most soldiers saw dead Indians as the only good Indians. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be sorry for me, he said quietly. Be sorry for what this place is doing to you. The words followed Margaret as she walked away, echoing in her mind like a challenge. That night, she stood at her window again, watching the stockade in the moonlight. The prisoner sat motionless in his cage, his face turned toward the stars. For the first time in her life, Margaret Caldwell began to question everything she'd been taught about enemies and allies, about right and wrong, about the invisible chains that bound her to a life she'd never chosen for herself. The morning brought visitors to Fort Harkera supply wagon from Fort Riley carrying mail, medicine, and 3 women whose husbands had been killed in recent raids. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as they climbed down from the wagon, their faces hollow with grief and rage. Mrs. Patterson lost her husband and 2 sons last month, her father explained, joining her at the window. The other ladies are widows too. They're here to see justice done. Margaret's blood chilled. What kind of justice? The kind that sends a message to every savage within 100 miles. The colonel's voice was grim. They want to watch the Comanche hang, but you haven't even questioned him yet. Don't need to. His guilt is written in his blood. Colonel Caldwell turned away from the window. The execution is set for tomorrow at dawn. I want you to witness it, Margaret. I want you to see what happens to those who threaten civilized people. Margaret's hand shook as she gripped the windowsill. I won't watch a murder. You'll watch justice being served, or you'll spend the next 3 months locked in your room. Her father's voice brooked no argument. The choice is yours. That afternoon, Margaret found herself drawn to the stockade again. The 3 widows stood nearby, their black dresses stark against the autumn grass. They spoke in low voices, their words carrying clearly across the quiet courtyard. String him up slow, Mrs. Patterson was saying. Make him suffer like our men suffered. Should have burned him alive, added another woman. That's what they did to my Tom. Margaret's stomach churned. She'd grown up hearing stories of Indian atrocities, but she'd also heard her mother's quieter tales of soldiers who killed children and burned villages. The truth, she was beginning to understand, was far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. You came back. The prisoner's voice was barely a whisper, meant only for her ears. I shouldn't have. Margaret glanced nervously at the widows, but they were too absorbed in their planning to notice her. But you did. He moved closer to the bars, his movements careful and deliberate. Because you know something's wrong here. You're going to die tomorrow, she said bluntly. They're going to hang you in front of the whole fort. I know. His voice was calm, accepting. I've known since they brought me here. Doesn't that frighten you? Yes. But not as much as living without hope. He studied her face carefully. You're different from the others. Why? Margaret hesitated, then found herself speaking words she'd never said aloud. My mother used to treat sick Indians who came to the fort. She said they were people, just like us. She said hatred was a disease that infected everyone it touched. What happened to her? Fever. She caught it from a Kiowa woman she was nursing. Margaret's voice cracked. Father says she died because she was too trusting, too soft. He says I have the same weakness. And what do you say? I say she died because she was brave enough to care about people who were different from her. Tears burned Margaret's eyes. I say the world lost something beautiful when she died. The prisoner was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke a single word in his own language, the syllables flowing like water over stones. What does that mean? Margaret asked. Aiyana. It means eternal blossom in Comanche. It was my sister's name. Was? She died defending the children when your soldiers attacked our winter camp 2 years ago. She was 16, barely older than you. His voice remained steady, but Margaret saw the pain flicker across his features. The soldiers called it a victory. We called it murder. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but she meant them with every fiber of her being. My sister believed that love was stronger than hate, that understanding could bridge any gap between people. Aiyana's eyes met hers through the bars. She would have liked you, I think. What's your real name? Margaret asked impulsively. Aiyana was my name too, before I became a warrior. Our people sometimes share names with those we've lost. He smiled sadly. But the whites call me John, because they can't pronounce anything else. I'll call you Aiyana if you want. I would like that. The sound of approaching boots made them both tense. Lieutenant Morrison appeared around the corner of the supply building, his pale eyes scanning the courtyard until they found Margaret. There you are, he said, his voice carrying the false warmth he used when others were watching. I've been looking for you. Margaret stepped back from the stockade, her heart racing. I was just what? Talking to the savage? Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. Your father wouldn't approve. I wasn't talking to anyone. Of course not. The lieutenant moved closer, his hand settling possessively on her elbow. Come, we need to discuss the wedding preparations. Only 2 months left now. As Morrison led her away, Margaret caught Aiyana's eye one last time. He mouthed a single word. Remember. That evening, Margaret sat in her room with her mother's journal, reading the careful observations about prairie flowers and frontier life. On the last page, written in her mother's fading hand, were the words that would change everything. The strongest flowers are those that bloom in the harshest conditions. They teach us that beauty and love can exist anywhere, if we're brave enough to let them grow. Outside her window, the stockade stood dark against the stars. Tomorrow, the man who'd shared his sister's name would die, and Margaret would be expected to watch. But as she closed the journal and prepared for bed, she found herself thinking not about death, but about eternal blossoms and the courage it took to let them grow in impossible places. The sound of hammering echoed across the fort as soldiers began building the gallows. Margaret pressed her hands over her ears, but she couldn't block out the sounder, the terrible certainty that tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. Blood dripped from the gallows platform onto the frost-covered ground as Margaret crept through the pre-dawn darkness, her bare feet silent on the wooden walkways of Fort Harker. In 6 hours, they would hang Aiyana, and she couldn't let that happen not when she'd spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, thinking about eternal blossoms and her mother's courage. The guard at the stockade was asleep, his rifle propped against a wooden post. Margaret had counted on this. Private Jenkins always dozed during the early morning watch, especially after a night of drinking with the other soldiers. She slipped past him like a shadow, her heart hammering so loud she was sure it would wake the entire fort. You shouldn't be here. Aiyana's voice was barely a whisper in the darkness. They're going to kill you today. Margaret knelt beside the bars, her hands shaking as she pulled a small bundle from beneath her shawl. I brought you food. And this. She pushed her mother's worn leather journal through the gap between the bars. Aiyana's fingers brushed hers as he took the journal, sending sparks up her arm. Why are you helping me? Because it's wrong. Because you're not their enemy. Margaret's voice cracked. Because I think I'm falling in love with you, and I don't know what to do about it. The words hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible canyon. Aiyana's breath caught, and for a moment, the bars separating them seemed to disappear entirely. Margaret. His voice was filled with wonder and pain. You know what this means, what it would cost you. I know. Tears streamed down her cheeks. I know it's impossible. I know my father would disown me, that the whole territory would call me a traitor. But I can't stop thinking about you, about the way you see the world. You make me want to be braver than I am. Aiyana reached through the bars, his fingertips barely touching her face. The eternal blossom, he whispered. My sister said it bloomed in the most unlikely places. Tell me about her. Please. I want to know everything." Aiyana's eyes grew distant. She was like sunlight on water, always moving, always laughing. She believed that love could heal anything, even the hatred between our peoples. His voice grew soft. "She would sneak away from our village to leave food for hungry travelers, no matter what tribe they came from. She said kindness was the only language everyone understood." "She sounds wonderful." "She was. And she would have loved you, I think. She always said the bravest people were those who chose compassion over fear." Aiyana's fingers traced the edge of Margaret's hand through the bars. "Like you're doing now." "I'm not brave. I'm terrified. Being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. That's what courage looks like." The sound of a door slamming made them both freeze. Footsteps echoed across the parade ground, coming closer. Margaret scrambled backward, pressing herself against the supply building as a figure emerged from the shadows. Lieutenant Morrison stood 10 feet away, his uniform rumpled, his pale hair disheveled. His eyes were bloodshot, and Margaret caught the sharp smell of whiskey on the morning air. Well. His voice was slurred but dangerous. "What do we have here? My faithful bride-to-be, visiting her savage boyfriend in the dark." "Charles, I can explain." "Can you?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "Can you explain why you're out here instead of in your bed, dreaming about our wedding? Can you explain why you look at him like he's some kind of hero instead of the animal he is?" Aiyana rose slowly, placing himself between Margaret and Morrison despite the bars that separated them. "Leave her alone. She's done nothing wrong." "Did I ask for your opinion, Red Man?" Morrison's hand moved to his sidearm. "You know what I think? I think you've been filling her head with lies, turning her against her own people with your heathen magic." "There's no magic here," Margaret said, finding her voice. "Only kindness, something you wouldn't understand." Morrison's face darkened. "Kindness? Is that what you call betraying everything your father stands for? Everything he's worked to build?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you have any idea what this will do to his reputation? What it will do to mine? I don't care about reputations." "You should. Because without your father's position, without my protection, you're nothing. Just another frontier girl with no prospects and no future." Morrison's laugh was cruel. "But maybe that's what you want. Maybe you'd rather live in a teepee, eating roots and berries, watching your half-breed children grow up as outcasts." Aiyana's roar of rage shook the stockade as he threw himself against the bars. "You will not speak of her that way." Morrison drew his pistol, pointing it directly at Aiyana's chest. "I'll speak of her however I please. She's going to be my wife after all." He cocked the hammer. "As for you, maybe we don't need to wait for the official execution. Maybe the territory would be safer with one less Comanche breathing right now." "No." Margaret lunged forward, placing herself between the gun and the bars. "If you want to shoot him, you'll have to shoot me first." The three of them stood frozen in the gray dawn light, the weight of the moment pressing down like storm clouds. Morrison's hand trembled. Whether from rage or whiskey, Margaret couldn't tell. "You're making a choice you'll regret for the rest of your life," Morrison said finally, lowering the weapon. "Both of you. When your father hears about this, and he will hear about it, you'll understand what real consequences look like." As Morrison stumbled away, Margaret sank against the stockade, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. Through the bars, Aiyana's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining like roots finding water in drought. "He'll tell your father," Aiyana said quietly. "I know." Margaret's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "But I won't let them kill you. Whatever it takes." "Margaret." Aiyana's voice was tender but urgent. "Some cages cannot be broken from the outside. Then I'll break them from the inside." As the sun climbed higher, painting the Kansas sky in shades of gold and amber, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She would not watch Aiyana die. She would not marry Morrison. She would not spend the rest of her life trapped in a cage of other people's expectations. The eternal blossom, she realized, wasn't just about love. It was about the courage to bloom despite the thorns. The colonel's office felt like a tomb when Margaret entered 3 hours later, her chin raised but her hands trembling. Lieutenant Morrison sat beside her father's desk, his uniform now clean and pressed, his face wearing a mask of righteous concern. Between them lay her mother's journal, open to a page covered with pressed wildflowers. "Sit down, Margaret Ann." Colonel Caldwell's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of calm that preceded explosions. "I prefer to stand, Father." That wasn't a request. His eyes were steel gray in the morning light streaming through the window. "Charles has told me some very disturbing things about your activities last night. I need to hear your side of the story." Margaret's gaze flicked to Morrison, who smiled coldly. "What would you like to hear, Father? That I've been talking to your prisoner? That I've been treating him like a human being instead of an animal? It's all true." The colonel's face reddened. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The damage to our family's honor? The gossip that will spread through every fort from here to California? I've done what Mother would have done. I've shown mercy to someone who needed it." "Your mother is dead." The words exploded from Colonel Caldwell's mouth like cannon fire. "Dead because she was too trusting, too soft-hearted. She insisted on nursing every sick Indian who stumbled to our gates, and it killed her. I won't lose you to the same foolish sentimentality." Margaret's hand flew to her throat, where her mother's locket usually rested, but she'd given it to Aiyana the night before, along with her promise to find a way to save him. Mother died because she believed in helping others. That's not foolish, that's brave. "Brave?" Morrison stood up, his voice dripping with disgust. "Is that what you call sneaking around in the dark? Whispering love words to a savage? Betraying your own kind for an animal? He's not an animal. He's shown me more kindness and understanding in 3 days than you have in 3 years. Morrison's face went white. "I see. So this is how you repay everything I've done for you. Everything I've offered you. A home, a future, respectability. And you throw it all away for a murderous heathen who'll scalp you the first chance he gets. He would never hurt me, wouldn't he?" The colonel leaned forward, his voice heavy with pain and anger. "Margaret, these people aren't like us. They don't value life the way civilized folks do. They raid and kill and burn without mercy. That Comanche in my stockade high's people have been terrorizing this territory for months. But not him. You said yourself he was found alone, wounded, with no weapons." "It doesn't matter." Colonel Caldwell slammed his fist on the desk, making the inkwell jump. "He's Comanche. His people killed the Henderson family last week, burned the Miller homestead last month. 3 children dead. Margaret, 3 innocent children. And you want me to show mercy to one of their killers?" Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart, but something deeper. The foundations of everything she'd been taught, everything she'd believed about right and wrong, justice and mercy. "Then I'm guilty too," she said quietly, "because I love him." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, she could hear the soldiers preparing for the execution, the scrape of wood against wood as they tested the gallows, the low murmur of voices discussing the morning's entertainment. "You will marry Lieutenant Morrison next week," the colonel said finally, his voice like winter ice. "And you will never speak to that prisoner again. That's an order. And if I refuse, then you'll be confined to your quarters until the wedding. And the Comanche dies today, as planned." Colonel Caldwell's eyes held no warmth, no fatherly love, only the cold calculation of a military commander. "The choice is yours, Margaret. Your duty to your family and your people, or the life of a savage." Margaret's world tilted sideways. Through the window, she could see the gallows standing stark against the morning sky, its rope swaying in the prairie wind. In 6 hours, Aiyana would climb those steps. In 6 hours, she would watch the light fade from his deep-water eyes. Unless she could find another way. "I need time to think," she said finally. "You have until noon," Morrison said, checking his pocket watch. "That's when the execution begins. Make your choice wisely, Margaret. There won't be another chance." As Margaret left the office, her mind was already racing ahead, calculating possibilities and risks. The fort had 50 soldiers, but most would be watching the execution. The gate would be lightly guarded. If she could get Aiyana out of the stockade during the ceremony, they might have a chance. But first, she needed help. Private Henderson was cleaning his rifle outside the barracks when Margaret found him. At 19, he was barely older than she was, with kind brown eyes and a gentle manner that set him apart from the other soldiers. "Miss Caldwell?" He scrambled to his feet, nearly dropping his weapon. "Is everything all right?" "No, it's not." Margaret glanced around to make sure they were alone. "Private Henderson, do you remember when you first arrived at the fort? How frightened you were?" "Yes, ma'am. I was scared out of my wits." "And who was kind to you?" Who helped you learn the routines, showed you how to survive? Henderson's face softened. Your mother, ma'am. She brought me soup when I was sick, wrote letters home for me when I couldn't find the words. His voice dropped to a whisper. She was an angel, Miss Caldwell. A true angel. She was. And she taught me that kindness is never wasted, even when it's dangerous. Margaret stepped closer. Private Henderson, there's an innocent man about to die, and I need your help to save him. Miss, I can't. You can. You just have to decide what kind of man you want to be. The kind who follows orders blindly, or the kind who stands up for what's right. Henderson stared at her for a long moment, his young face troubled. Finally, he nodded. What do you need me to do? As Margaret outlined her desperate plan, she felt her mother's spirit guiding her hands, her mother's courage flowing through her veins. The eternal blossom was about to bloom in the most dangerous place of Allen, the heart of an enemy fort, watered by love and tended by hope. But first, she had to survive the next 6 hours without anyone discovering what she intended to do. The rope snapped tight with a sound like breaking bones, and Margaret's scream died in her throat as she watched the test dummy drop from the gallows platform. Noon was only an hour away, and the entire fort buzzed with excitement as soldiers gathered in the parade ground, their faces eager for the day's entertainment. Works perfectly, Sergeant Williams announced, examining the knot with professional pride. Drop him clean, break his neck quick, won't be any suffering. Margaret pressed herself against the supply building, fighting waves of nausea. Around her, the fort had transformed into something unrecognizable, a place where decent people gathered to watch death like it was a carnival show. Women had arrived from nearby settlements, bringing picnic lunches and folding chairs. Children ran between the soldiers' legs, playing games, while their parents discussed the best view of the execution. Margaret, Morrison's voice cut through the crowd noise. There you are. Come, your father wants you front and center for the ceremony. I can't. The words came out as a whisper. You can, and you will. His grip on her arm was iron strong. Unless you've decided to take my generous offer, marry me today, and the Comanche lives until tomorrow. That gives us time to negotiate other terms. Margaret stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the cold calculation behind his pale eyes. You planned this. You wanted father to catch us together. Morrison's smile was razor thin. I wanted you to understand your position. You're nothing without me, Margaret. Nothing without your father's protection. The frontier doesn't forgive women who step outside their place. And if I marry you? What then? Then you learn to be grateful for what I give you. A home, children, respectability. His fingers tightened on her arm. And you forget all about savage lovers and foolish romantic notions. The crowd was growing louder, more restless. Margaret could see Aiyana through the gaps between bodies sat calmly in the center of his cage, his face turned toward the sky. Even from a distance, she could see the peace in his posture, the acceptance that made her heart break and rage at the same time. 5 minutes, Miss Caldwell, Morrison said, checking his pocket watch again. Choose quickly. That's when Margaret saw him, Private Henderson, standing near the stockade with a ring of keys hanging from his belt. Their eyes met across the crowd, and he gave her the slightest nod. Everything was ready. Now she just had to create the right distraction. I'll marry you, she said loudly, her voice carrying over the crowd noise. A cheer went up from the soldiers nearby. Morrison's face lit up with triumph, but Margaret wasn't finished. I'll marry you, she repeated, stepping up onto a wooden crate so everyone could see her. But first, I want to say goodbye to the prisoner. I want to look him in the eye and tell him what he's cost me. The crowd murmured approval. This was even better entertainment than a simple hanging. Colonel Caldwell pushed through the press of bodies, his face a mixture of relief and pride. That's my girl, he said quietly, doing the right thing at last. Margaret climbed down from the crate and walked toward the stockade, her heart hammering against her ribs. The crowd followed, pressing close to hear what the colonel's daughter would say to her former captor. Even the 3 widows gathered near, their black dresses like ravens among the blue uniforms. Open the cage, Margaret called out. I want to face him properly. Now see here. Sergeant Williams started to protest, but Colonel Caldwell cut him off. Do it. Let her have her moment. Henderson stepped forward, fumbling with the keys. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped them twice before finding the right one. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo across the prairie. Margaret stepped inside the cage, and suddenly the crowd noise faded to a whisper. She was alone with Aiyana, in a space no bigger than a horse stall, surrounded by 50 hostile faces, but feeling safer than she had in days. "Are you ready?" she whispered so quietly only he could hear. Aiyana's eyes widened slightly, but his expression remained calm. "Always." Margaret turned to face the crowd, her voice ringing clear across the parade ground. "This man is not your enemy," she called out. "He's never killed anyone from this territory. He was found wounded and alone, probably left behind by his own people." "Shut her up!" someone yelled from the back of the crowd. "Let her talk," Mrs. Patterson called back. "Let her humiliate herself properly. You want to know the truth about this war?" Margaret's voice grew stronger. "The truth is that we're all prisoners. Prisoners of fear, prisoners of hatred, prisoners of the lies we tell ourselves about who deserves to live and who deserves to die." Colonel Caldwell stepped forward, his face darkening. "That's enough, Margaret. Come out of there." "No, Father. I'm tired of following orders that make no sense. Tired of pretending that murder is justice, just because we call it something else." Margaret reached for Aiyana's hand, their fingers intertwining in full view of the crowd. "This man showed me what courage really looks like, what love really means." The crowd erupted in shouts and curses. Morrison drew his pistol, pointing it directly at Aiyana. "Step away from him, Margaret, now! If you want to shoot him, you'll have to shoot me first." That's when everything went wrong. A rifle cracked from the watchtower, and chaos exploded across the parade ground. "Raiders!" the sentry screamed. "Comanche war party, coming fast from the east!" Suddenly, nobody cared about executions or scandals. Soldiers scattered in every direction, running for weapons and defensive positions. Women grabbed their children and fled toward the fort's main building. In the confusion, Margaret saw her chance. "Now!" she hissed to Henderson, who threw her a second set of keys. But Morrison wasn't distracted by the approaching war party. His pale eyes remained fixed on Margaret and Aiyana, his pistol steady despite the chaos around him. "You think I'm fool enough to fall for that trick?" he snarled. "There's no war party. Just your boyfriend's friends. Come to rescue him." Aiyana stepped protectively in front of Margaret. "You're wrong. Those aren't my people. Liar." Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot, when it came, was deafening in the small space of the stockade. But it wasn't Morrison who fired. Private Henderson stood behind the lieutenant, smoking pistol in his hand, his young face white with shock. "I couldn't let him hurt Miss Caldwell," Henderson whispered as Morrison crumpled to the ground. "I just couldn't." Another rifle crack echoed from the watchtower, followed by war whoops that chilled Margaret's blood. Real raiders this time, drawn by the noise and confusion. The fort's worst nightmare was about to begin, and she was trapped in the center of it with the man she loved and a boy who'd just committed treason to save them both. "Can you ride?" she asked Aiyana urgently. "Like the wind," he replied. Already moving toward the gate Henderson had left open. "Then let's go home," Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Because suddenly she understood that home wasn't a place or a building, it was wherever she and Aiyana could be together, free from the cages other people had built around their hearts. Thunder crashed overhead as Margaret and Aiyana raced across the Kansas prairie, their stolen horses' hooves pounding rhythm against the rain-soaked earth. Behind them, Fort Harker burned like a torch against the storm-dark sky, orange flames licking at the watchtowers, where real Comanche raiders had struck just minutes after their escape. "There!" Aiyana pointed toward a line of cottonwood trees along Walnut Creek. "We can rest the horse and wait out the worst of the storm." Margaret clung to his waist as they rode. Her wedding dress, the one Morrison had insisted she wear for their hasty ceremony, now torn and muddy from their desperate flight. She'd grabbed her mother's medical bag and what little food she could carry. But everything else from her old life was ash and memory now. They dismounted in the shelter of the trees, their bodies pressed together as much for warmth as for comfort. The storm raged around them, but Margaret felt safer here in the wilderness than she ever had inside the fort's walls. "The raiders weren't your people," she said, studying Aiyana's face in the lightning flashes. "No. Kiowa, I think, from their war paint. They must have been tracking the same patrol that captured me." His expression darkened. There will be blood tonight, on both sides. Margaret thought of Private Henderson, who'd killed Morrison to save her life. Of her father, leading the defense against attackers who'd come seeking their own justice. Of the 3 widows who'd wanted to watch Aiyana hang, now probably huddled in the fort's basement, praying for dawn. Was I wrong? She whispered. To choose love over duty? To put my happiness before everyone else's safety? Aiyana cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses from years of riding and fighting. Love is never wrong, Margaret, but love without wisdom can be dangerous to everyone it touches. Then what do we do now? Where do we go? Before Aiyana could answer, they heard hoofbeats approaching through the storm. Margaret's heart clenched pursuit already, when they'd barely escaped the fort's burning walls. But as the riders emerged from the rain, she saw they weren't soldiers. 3 Comanche warriors sat their horses like extensions of the animals themselves, their faces painted for war, their weapons ready. The leader was older, perhaps 40, with scars across his chest and silver in his braided hair. When he spoke, it was in rapid Comanche that Margaret couldn't understand. Aiyana answered in the same language, his voice respectful but firm. The conversation went back and forth for several minutes, while Margaret stood frozen, aware that her life hung in the balance of words she couldn't comprehend. Finally, the older warrior switched to broken English. She is the one? The white woman who freed you? She is, Aiyana replied. Her name is Margaret. She risked everything to save my life. The warrior studied Margaret with eyes like chips of obsidian. You know what you have done, white woman? You have chosen exile from your people, chosen to live as we live, hunted and hated by those who once called you daughter. I know. Margaret's voice was steady despite her fear. I made my choice with open eyes. And if we take you to our village? If you become one of us? Can you hunt and gather your own food? Can you tend wounds and birth children without the soft comforts of the white world? Margaret thought of her mother, who traveled the frontier as a young woman, learning herbs and healing from any who would teach her. I can learn. My mother taught me that strength comes from adapting, not from clinging to what was. The warrior nodded slowly. Your mother, the one who healed our people when sickness came to our camp. We remember her kindness. Margaret's breath caught. You knew her? She saved my son's life during the fever winter, 10 years past. Asked for nothing in return, though we offered horses and furs. The warrior's harsh expression softened slightly. We called her Gentle Thunder, quiet as rain, but powerful as the storm. Tears mixed with raindrops on Margaret's cheeks. All those times her mother had disappeared for days, claiming she was gathering herbs. She'd been visiting the Comanche camps, healing their sick, building bridges her daughter never knew existed. She never told me, Margaret whispered. White world would not understand, just as they do not understand you now. The warrior gestured toward the burning fort. You cannot go back, Margaret, who was white. Daughter, that life is ended. But you can go forward, if you have courage. Aiyana took her hand, his fingers warm and strong. Come with us to the winter camp. Learn our ways. Let us learn yours. Your mother began something that was left unfinished, a bridge between our peoples. Maybe we can build it together. Margaret looked back once toward Fort Harker, where she'd spent the first 17 years of her life. The flames were dying now, leaving only smoke and regret drifting across the prairie. Her father would think her dead, or worse. Morrison was already dead, killed by a boy who'd believed in something larger than orders. The world she'd known was ash. But as she turned toward Aiyana and the waiting warriors, Margaret felt something bloom in her chestnut. The desperate love of the past few days, but something deeper and more lasting. Hope, perhaps, or courage, or simply the understanding that some choices, once made, opened doors that could never be closed again. Yes, she said simply. I'll come. As they rode north through the storm, leaving the burning fort behind, Margaret clutched her mother's medical bag and thought about eternal blossoms. Her mother had planted the seeds years ago with her quiet acts of healing. Now Margaret would tend the garden, helping love grow in soil that had been watered with too much blood for too long. The thunder was fading, and somewhere ahead, beyond the storm and the darkness, dawn was waiting. A new dawn, for a new life, with a man who'd taught her that the strongest cages were the ones people built in their own heart sand, that love, real love, always held the key to breaking them. Behind them, Fort Harker's ashes scattered on the wind, carrying the old world away. Ahead lay territory unknown, dangerous and beautiful and free. Margaret Caldwell was dead, buried in the ruins of duty and fear. But Margaret, who chose love, was just beginning to bloom.